As you saw in the announcement, my talk today is titled Using Fairy Tales to Foster Intercultural Awareness in Young EFL, it should be EIL learners. And basically what I will be sharing with you today is a few things about why intercultural awareness matters in early English as a foreign language and English as an international language. I'm going to try to talk a little bit about, making the shift from a communicative approach to language teaching to an intercultural approach to language teaching. I'm going to use a four-step process framework. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then we'll look at fairy tales as age-appropriate critical incidents, and I'm going to use Goldilocks as an example. And then I'll move on to some practical classroom applications and support to language development before I round things off with the challenges and teacher positioning. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about my own journey and who I am, not because I like talking about myself, but because I want to share with you how I kind of got involved in the business, quote unquote, of language education, intercultural communication, language, etc. So it all starts here in a city called Patras. That's where I was born. And when I was very, very young, this is my hometown, when I was only about 7 or 8, and this is my work town, Corfu, because as Tomai said, my main job is at Ioannis University in Greece. So you're more than welcome to visit Corfu, especially in the summer. It's a great place for holidays, but it's also a great place if you're interested in culture and museums, etc. So my journey, that's not me, by the way. So when I was about 7 or 8 months old, my parents decided to immigrate from Greece to Canada. And this kind of shows my let's say my journey from Greece to Canada to Eastern Canada, where I stayed or I lived till about the age of 12. From a very early age, when I was in day school, in nursery school, in elementary school, I saw diversity all around me. I was in classes with students from literally all corners of the world. I remember in the first few grades of primary school, from the Philippines, from India, China, Lebanon, Poland, Portugal, just to name a few countries of some of my classmates. And, as a young child, you grow up in this situation. Because in those days, Greece was very monocultural. I'm talking about the late 70s, early 80s now. So, growing up in Canada, I realized from a very young age what diversity is all about. And this is actually the street I grew up in. So then when I was about 12, we moved back to Greece. And this is now about mid-80s, where I saw that there was not a lot of diversity in those days in Greece. To be honest, when I was in my school, in my particular school, my brother and I were actually the only students who were, let's say, from another country. Although we were Greek, we were raised in Canada, so we were considered foreigners, let's say, which felt quite strange, I would say. And almost odd because we were made to feel that we were the foreigners, the strangers. And then when I was about 17, I moved back to Canada, but this time to Western Canada. So again, I was placed in a very diverse, very multicultural environment. This time it was Calgary. That's where I went to university, the University of Calgary, my alma mater. So this was a very interesting experience for me because this is now the early 90s where, again, I am surrounded by people. I think in those days we had students from about 100 or so different countries. So this was a very enriching experience for me. And that's when I started developing my interest more and more in diversity and linguistic diversity, cultural diversity. And that's why I went into studying like linguistics and English and education, etc. And then when I was about 25 years old, I moved back to Greece as a teacher, teaching in all levels of education, primary, secondary. And teaching in primary education, I started to discover my love of teaching of young kids. And that lasted for a few years until I went on to become a professor at the university. So reaching the present, I just described a little bit about my past because I wanted to show you how I actually became interested in all this. Because I also had firsthand involvement as a student and later on as an academic. So we will continue with a bit of theory. I promise to keep, to apply the KISS principle. So I'm going to try to keep it as short and simple as possible. But I need to create some theoretical grounding in order for us to be on the same page. Now, according to quite a few people, intercultural communication is the most important skill to acquire in the 21st century. At least that's what Verge supports. I would say it is one of the most important skills to acquire in the 21st century. And judging by the number of people that are present, I think you probably agree with this premise, and that's why you are here today. So that's also my starting premise. I think we can all agree that one of our roles today as teachers, as educators in general, is to help our students develop the necessary competencies, skills, etc., to be part of this globalized world. So without a doubt, we all know that English is a global lingua franca. It's spoken by people from many cultural backgrounds and not just native speakers. So, the last few decades, there has been this shift. Students need to learn, to navigate cross-cultural interactions. It's not just about American and not just about British norms anymore. And then cultural adaptability is a key 21st century skill as well. So we all know that language and culture are inseparable. They go hand in hand. Teaching English in isolation from its cultural context can limit learners' ability to communicate effectively and appropriately. And not only its cultural context, but we will see later also like a global context. Now, I've highlighted the words effectively and appropriately because we often find these two words as I would consider them keywords when we talk about intercultural communication, because often the focus is on effective communication. And, when we talk about effective communication, we basically mean being able to convey the message clearly. But in doing so, did we deliver the message in an appropriate way? And here culture comes into play. So we talk about cultural appropriacy. So was the message delivered in an appropriate way, or did we offend someone in doing so? So that's something we don't often talk about in language teaching. We just talk about the effectiveness of communication, but not the appropriateness. And I'll come back to that later. Now, I don't know if you agree, but I still feel that culture is often overlooked and often neglected in classrooms. And Barland talked about this and called it cultural myopia. As I explained below, it's the belief that one's own culture is appropriate and relevant in all situations and to all people. And even, especially in the past, even when books tried to incorporate culture, they did it in a kind of a fragmented way. They would either do it in kind of like a tour, let's say book style. They would just give tips, bits and pieces of just cultural elements, or they would isolate any talk about culture kind of in the last page. I remember characteristically a book, maybe it was about 15 years ago or so. They had the last page of the unit called the culture corner, and they would completely isolate cultural elements from the rest of the unit. Things have changed. thank God. And I see more and more books now incorporating culture along with the linguistic aspects. But then the question becomes, whose culture or which culture are we referring to? And the literature agrees, so the scholarly literature agrees that we should be talking, first of all, about our own culture. So trying to help students find representations of their own culture in the material. And then there should also be reference to target culture. So if we're teaching English, for example, we can have cultural elements regarding English-speaking countries and not just Britain or not just the US. And then, of course, we need to move on. And I think this is where a lot of the course books that are used in the EFL lack, the kind of this notion of global culture, developing this notion of global culture and not just, let's say, keying or just focusing on target culture, because usually until now it's the target culture that's being focused on. So there's a lot of there's not a lot of emphasis on students' own culture and global culture. It's usually the target culture. So if, for example, you're using a British course book, it's likely to have a lot of focus on the target culture. Not all course books, as I said, a lot of course books have moved beyond that, thankfully, but I think we still have a long way to go. And talking about culture, keep in mind kind of this notion, this distinction between big C and small c culture, because often we think about culture kind of at the national level, like Italian culture, Portuguese culture, Greek culture, but we should also be looking at culture with a small c. And this is the focus here is more on day-to-day and behavioral patterns of daily life. And we'll come back to this a little bit later. So since we're focusing on young learners, I'm just showing you some indicative literature on the importance of early intercultural learning. So research shows that children develop attitudes towards difference at a very early age. Early language education plays a key role in shaping openness and empathy. And openness and empathy are key concepts in intercultural awareness and intercultural competence. And intercultural competence is fostered through guided reflection, not just exposure alone. So just exposing students to cultural input without guided reflection, I don't think it's going to take us very far, okay? Because again, if we deal with culture at a very superficial level, then I don't think we're giving our young learners the full chance to kind of reflect. And when it comes to the research support for early intercultural learning, but this time on story-based approaches, so using, for example, fairy tales, as I'll be discussing later, there is research that supports emotional engagement, that story-based approaches help support emotional engagement. Stories allow children to explore values in kind of a safe context, and they can be used as critical incidents. And I'll show you later what I mean by this and how we can use the fairy tale of Goldilocks as a critical incident to help our young learners reflect in a way. And just to make sure that we are all on the same page, I have this table here which shows the different concepts that we use. So cultural awareness, intercultural awareness, cultural competence, and intercultural competence. Because we're talking about learners at this age, so young learners, I think it's more appropriate to be talking about cultural awareness and intercultural awareness. So it's basically helping our students recognizing, similarities and differences, helping them make comparisons, which I think are quite age appropriate, because when we talk about cultural competence, intercultural competence, these are more advanced cognitive levels. So we need to help our students or learners first become aware before we can move on to helping them build their competencies, which happen at later stages. So the other issue I want to bring up is moving away from the communicative approach, because as you all know, the last couple of decades, we've been talking about the communicative approach, but let's try to move away from the communicative approach onto or towards the intercultural language teaching approach. And here I have another table that shows what the communicative approach entails, but also what the intercultural approaches can entail. And often I think the concern of many language practitioners is that, and I get this a lot from my master's students who are all practicing teachers, when we talk about this, one of the concerns I get is, oh, so should we neglect, the linguistic aspects of the language? And I always tell them, well, no one says neglect any linguistic aspects, because taking an intercultural approach and focusing on culture doesn't mean that you're not focusing on language per se. Intercultural competence and awareness generally encompasses and builds upon linguistic and communicative competences, treating language as a foundational tool rather than a separate skill. So while so intercultural competence basically includes linguistic competence as well. And if I draw on Michael Byram's influential framework for intercultural communication competence, he talks a lot about linguistic, social linguistic, and discourse competence as necessary components, but he also stresses the importance of attitude, knowledge, and critical cultural awareness and intercultural awareness. So one approach doesn't mean that we are neglecting the other. I think an intercultural approach is a more, it's kind of a more umbrella approach, let's say, or a more all-inclusive approach. So it doesn't by no means undermine the importance of other communicative aspects or linguistic aspects. Okay, so please rest assured. Now, when we talk about, sorry for the spelling there, intercultural awareness, some of the key aspects in intercultural and cultural awareness are empathy, respect, openness, curiosity, and embracing. So during our approach to language teaching and language learning and the use of fairy tales, for example, these are some of the notions we should aim for, helping our students, cultivate their empathy and their respect and an attitude of openness and non-judgment, curiosity, and embracing. And I would like to take a quick look at what all these notions entail. Starting with respect, when I was young, at least, and when I was in school, I recall teachers often saying, try to apply the golden rule. And what is the golden rule, which is also often called an ethics of reciprocity. So the golden rule was treating others as one would want to be treated by them. So I will treat you the way I want to be treated. But what's the problem with that rule? Respect can be very unique. How I want to be treated might not be the same way as you want to be treated. So I think we should kind of revisit this golden rule. And then some people thought about another rule, which they call the platinum rule. And they support that we should treat others the way that they want to be treated. So I will treat you the way you want to be treated. But then the obvious question becomes, how do I know how you want to be treated, right? So that's also a little bit problematic. And I think we have to conclude that both these rules, the golden and the platinum, are culturally bound and can be unintentionally, and we can unintentionally assume a shared understanding of respect, which may not exist across cultures. So the way I understand respect might be completely different compared to the way you understand respect. So respect can simply be recognizing, if I want to put it simply, because then the question becomes, So what is respect? I think it's just basically trying to value, to recognizing people's value as individuals, separate from our own preferences. So it's just valuing individuals for who they are, if we want to put it in very simple terms. So respect is one of the things that we need, I think, to cultivate if we're going to take an intercultural approach in our teaching. Now, the other notion, which is very, very important in intercultural communication, is the notion of empathy, which we often confuse with the notion of sympathy. Now, sympathy and empathy, some people may argue they're quite similar terms, when in fact they're not that similar, in the sense that sympathy is a more passive, I think it's more passive, where empathy is quite active. And I found this, and I thought I'd share it with you, where this person says, I just found this on the internet the other day, empathy is walking a mile in someone else's shoes, where sympathy is just being sorry their feet hurt. So sympathy is taking kind of a more passive stance towards something, and whereas empathy is actually getting more involved. And I also found this, which I think is interesting. So again, someone saying sympathy, that means they're just saying, I'm sorry to see that you were hurting. Whereas empathy, you're hurting, has me feeling hurt with you. Okay, so again, this is a notion that we try to cultivate in our students, and we can do this also with the use of fairy tales. And then another important notion is curiosity. You know, at these ages, or at basically young learners, but I think people in general are quite inquisitive. And inquisitiveness is a crucial element of intercultural effectiveness. So this natural desire to learn, you know, and in English, we do say curiosity killed the cat. But in this case, curiosity is good. So we want to encourage our students to be inquisitive, to try to view differences as an opportunity for learning, as an opportunity to reflect, and not as an opportunity to judge, for example. And then the notion of openness, again, a very important concept in intercultural learning. Openness means basically suspending criticism, not judging. Because as people, we naturally judge, we naturally criticize anything that's different, anything that doesn't look familiar. One of our first reactions is to judge and criticize. I mean, I catch myself doing this at this age, and after all my studying and traveling. I mean, I've traveled the world, I've lived in different countries, yet I still catch myself sometimes stereotyping and judging. But that's something we need to be aware of as educators as well. Openness to difference or the unknown, open to engage with the unfamiliar, because sometimes we are resistant. We don't want to engage with the unfamiliar. And this fosters understanding, collaboration, and positive relationships between individuals from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds. And then the last term is embracing. Often in the literature, and even nowadays, we still come across the word tolerate or tolerance. I have a kind of an issue with the word tolerance. I don't know about you, but tolerance for me almost has kind of a negative connotation, because it's more about accepting something passively. You know, okay, don't bother me, I don't want to deal with you, I'll just tolerate you. Whereas embracing is something much more active. It's actively valuing, it's actively understanding, and trying to incorporate diverse perspectives in the way we view things. So moving on to, because earlier I said using fairy tales as a critical incident is quite important. So what is a critical incident, especially with reference to early foreign language learning? It's a moment of puzzlement. It can be a clash of expectations. Usually at this level, we try to use critical incidents where there's no clear villain, you know, like the bad guy. But they do serve as grand opportunities for meaning making. I don't know if you're all familiar with the use of critical incidents and if you use them, but basically it's taking an incident. It could be a true incident or we can, create this incident where there was a misunderstanding, for example, or miscommunication. And in our case, we try to make the kind of connect them to culture. So it's this misunderstanding or miscommunication was due to cultural issues or because of cultural diversity. So why use fairy tales as critical incidents? Because narratives embed implicit cultural norms. Tales tend to be emotionally engaging and they are pedagogically safe. So if we use an age-appropriate fairy tale, they're quite pedagogically safe. They are a good opportunity for perspective taking. And again, if dealt with in an appropriate way, they allow for recursive reflection, because even at this age, learners are able to reflect if they're guided in an appropriate way. Now, so using fairy tales as critical incidents, as I said, is something I feel is something good. But in order to help us kind of have a set model in our minds while using fairy tales as critical incidents, I thought I would share. I don't know if you're familiar with this four-step process, but it's a four-step model that Lidicode and Scarino talked about. And it's used to help intercultural language learning. So this is a framework for intercultural language learning. And they talked about these four steps: noticing, comparing, reflecting, and interacting. And I'll show you how we can use these steps with reference to the fairy tale, which we are going to use as an example. So when they talked about noticing, they meant that learners become aware of linguistic and cultural similarities and differences. You'll see me stressing both similarities and differences because, again, when we come across something culturally different, we tend to focus on differences rather than similarities. And it's important to focus on both. And I dare to say, for me, it's even more important to focus on similarities rather than differences. And developing awareness of how language and culture are interconnected. So we help learners develop this awareness. And we help our learners notice that people, for example, in English-speaking countries or any of any linguistic background, may speak, may greet, may eat, may celebrate, or behave differently. And the goal here is to build curiosity and awareness. Remember, young learners are naturally curious and inquisitive. So we're building on this curiosity and awareness that help people do things in different, but also similar ways. And helping them understand that, just because someone is doing something in a different way doesn't mean that it's good or bad. It's just different. Then the next stage they talked about was comparing. So learners analyze and interpret, again, similarities and differences between cultures. Learners can compare how we do it and how they do it. But at the end, it's important to kind of, we shouldn't create, it's my opinion that we shouldn't create big distances between the we and the and the them, because then otherness becomes an issue. So for example, we can ask them to compare birthday celebrations in their country and in other countries, breakfast foods, etc. Things that learners at this age can cope with. And understand that differences are normal and interesting, not strange. I think as teachers, we're often very guilty when we see something that we find that is new to us. For example, something cultural, we might say, oh, that's quite a strange habit, or we might even judge in a more negative way. I think that's something that we should try to avoid. So avoid judgment. And then the third stage they talked about is reflecting. So learners critically reflect, up to the point where they can at this age, on their own identity, their beliefs and perspectives. And I'm going to show you some examples later. For example, discussing kindness and respect in different cultures and what these entail. So learners can talk about, is it okay if people celebrate differently? You know, when we're discussing different celebrations around the world. And hopefully the goal here is to develop empathy and respect for diversity. And moving on to the last stage, which they named interacting, learners apply their intercultural understanding in real or simulated communication. So, for example, you can at these stages of learning, you can role play greetings, practicing polite expressions, like using body language. So if they see a video or a book where they have the namaste, explaining that, etc. Remember that intercultural language learning is not about learning, learning about, I should say here, is not learning about cultures, but it's about learning how to engage with culture, with cultural elements. So we're not trying to teach our students about cultures in a superficial way, but we're trying to help them engage with cultural aspects. And also remember that the stages I just presented to you are not necessarily done in a linear way. They could be recursive, etc. So I think that's enough with some theoretical the background or some theoretical scaffolding to help us understand how we can now use, you know, fairy tales and this 4-step model and use it with our young learners. So as I said earlier, I chose randomly, completely, like I was going through the various fairy tales that I'm also familiar with. And I thought, okay, let's see how resourceful I can be with using Goldilocks and the Three Bears, which is a well-known fairy tale in various parts of the world. So the plot, in case you don't remember, is this. So if you want to give it a quick look, so I can take a sip of water. Okay, quite a simple story with some, but it does give us some nice or some opportunity for reflection and for interaction, etc. And I'll show you how right now. And these are just the key plot points. And let's see now how we can map the 4 intercultural processes that we just saw and Goldilocks. So noticing. So the goal here can be to help learners see similarity and difference without judgment. We can focus on the bear's house, the different objects that are presented to us in the fairy tale, like the bowls, the chairs, and the beds, and different emotions, for example, surprise, confusion. So we're at this level where we're just helping our students, our learners, notice. And if we have very young learners, we can prompt them by asking questions like, what do you see? Is this Goldilocks' house, or has she entered someone else's house? Whose bowl is this? And then, you know, questions can get a little bit more advanced, like what is different here? What do you see that looks different to you? What does Goldilocks do? Again, remember that the teacher should avoid evaluation words like good or bad, etc. Then moving on to comparing, and always, you know, we're always talking about Goldilocks now, so I'm just using this as an example. Remember to try to connect the story world with the learner's own world. So again, focus on homes. Do your homes look different when we compare to that of the story? What kind of rules do you have at your home? What are the family expectations? For example, during lunch, when you all sit down and eat. In your house, can you sit on any chair, or do you have a specific chair that you sit and another chair that maybe your sibling sits on, or your parents, etc.? Do you ask first before you can get something, or can you just go ahead and do it or get it? And for older students, we have other questions like looking at, again, similarities and differences. At home, what do you do when you visit someone? or when someone visits you. And then reflecting, it's here we can help our learners explore feelings and meanings. We can focus on emotions, and we can ask simple questions like, how do you think the baby bear, how do you think the baby bear feels? Do you think he or she is happy or sad? How would you feel if someone came into your room uninvited? Or why is Goldilocks scared? And you know, reflections may be expressed through gestures, through using their L1, of course, because they don't have the linguistic repertoires, through drawings. And what we do is we help foster reflection at this stage. And then interacting is acting on understanding through language and behavior. So we can use puppets. Puppets are a fantastic way for role playing. We can get our learners to role play, acting out polite requests, saying sorry, using simple, you know, like question words or modal verbs like can I, etc. Just simple things, linguistic aspects that learners at this age can handle. So Goldilocks as an intercultural case study, you know, we can focus on things like entering without permission, either using others' belongings, and just the emotional reactions of the bears. Here I've put in a table to see how we can take the four or some of the aspects we talked about, for example, respect, empathy, curiosity, and openness, and connect them to the intercultural focus, to an intercultural focus regarding the fairy tale. So when it comes to respect, for example, asking permission, respecting other space, empathy, seeing the story from each character's perspective. So ask learners, you know, to kind of react, like to express their feelings, as we said earlier. Do you feel sad? Would you feel angry? Curiosity, exploring other people's homes. This might be a nice opportunity to show students pictures of homes, of typical homes in other countries. And then openness, again, you know, suspending judgment, because, you know, some students might say, oh, Goldilocks is bad, is a bad girl, for example, and, you know, get them to explain why you think that, and, you know, that we shouldn't judge people so easily, etc. So the question is, can this work well interculturally? And my answer is yes, because this is basically a ready-made critical incident, and it raises interesting questions like regarding respect, you know, private space, respecting boundary, empathy, again, curiosity, and openness. Again, understanding different ways of living, or people have different rules in their homes, etc. And here I've put it all kind of in one table. So keep in mind this more general framework, again, regarding respect, curiosity, empathy, and openness. So why is it age appropriate? Why would all this be age appropriate? Because there's a very low cognitive load, so it's not a very complex fairy tale. There can be clear emotions, and this is something you can discuss with your learners. We can use a lot of repetitive language, and remember, there's no villain, so there's no bad person here. And also there's intercultural richness, so different ideas of politeness and permission, the social rules, private space versus public or shared space. And crucially, Goldilocks is not bad. She follows different expectations. So because she behaved in the way she behaved doesn't make her bad. And maybe the bears, you know, if we want to justify why they're angry, you can get your learners explain, well, that their space has been violated. You know, she entered their house, she ate their food, she slept in their beds without getting permission. So this story is quite ideal for intercultural misunderstanding. And that's why, as I said earlier, you can use it as a critical incident. So the key message in early language learning and intercultural learning is about attitudes, not cultural facts. So when we teach, for example, English to preschool and early primary learners, we are not preparing them to memorize facts about other cultures. So that's not our goal. But what we are doing is helping them learn how to respond to difference with the notions I talked about several times: curiosity, respect, empathy, and openness, and just the notion of embracing difference and similarity. So when choosing a fairy tale, my advice would be not to just focus on Western fairy tales. So this was a popular more of Western fairy tales, but I would go as, you know, I would actually encourage you to use non-Eurocentric or Western, let's say, fairy tales, because helping our students or sharing fairy tales from around the world might make it even more interesting. I also like to always keep in mind what Bishop said and described in her book, Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors. So we can use fairy tales as mirrors because children see their own culture reflected. We can see fairy tales as windows because they learn about other cultures. You know, I like using the wow effect, so windows on the world, because through fairy tales, students, it's like a big window on the world, and you can see elements of other cultures. And also sliding doors, because they imaginatively enter other worlds, and that's kind of the fun part of using fairy tales in language learning. So as teachers, because as teachers, obviously, we facilitate everything. So the teacher is the mediator, not a judge, is a model of curiosity. So when you model curiosity, students will also engage in this. And you also become a guide for emotional language. And I think as teachers, we should ask open-ended questions, avoid moralizing by all means. And I would say always try to validate multiple perspectives. So any perspective, you know, as long as it's, I want to say that any perspective is okay, as long as there's no, you know, stereotyping or judgment, because when this is done, or when we see students or our learners, you know, stereotype or judge, then this becomes a good opportunity to have these nice talks with them about why it's not good to stereotype or judge. And remember, intercultural learning happens in the questions we ask and not the answers that we give. So the challenges and ethical considerations that, again, we should keep in mind is what I just talked about, like the stereotyping and just biases that we might have, or prejudices, and presenting one culture as the norm, because I think often we as teachers can be guilty of that, presenting, you know, one culture as the norm, and all other cultures should be kind of compared to the culture that we use as the norm. And try to avoid simplifying difference into right or wrong. Instead, focus on attitudes, embrace ambiguity, and keep language development central. And how about language? Intercultural work enhances language development. As I said, this should not scare you that, oh, so where does language come in? There's a lot of language that can come in, because if we're looking at, for example, vocabulary, you know, you can angry, surprised, scared, using politeness markers. For example, please. Yes, I think someone has their microphone on. Yes, thank you. So politeness markers like please, sorry, can I? different simple objects, like everyday objects that are in the story, like chair, bed, bowl, etc. And then moving on to grammar aspects, like using simple modal verbs like can I, past tenses, and comparatives like bigger, smaller, hotter, etc. And different functions, so requesting, apologizing, expressing feeling, and comparing. So in such a short story, you can see all these linguistic aspects. So the answer is yes. Stories, apart from serving as sources of intercultural awareness development, they're also sources of good language development. And sometimes the question becomes, okay, so how can I assess intercultural learning? So if I use all this, well, if you feel the need that you want to assess, you can use observation checklists. For example, does the child ask questions? Language use and role play, monitor the language that is being used from their drawings and what is reflected in their drawings. And just, keeping portfolio entries, for example, emotional vocabulary development, etc. These are just examples. So approaching the end of my talk today, I'd like to give you some key takeaways. So intercultural awareness starts early, or at least it should start early. Stories are powerful intercultural tools. Critical incidents can be gentle and playful if we use them in an appropriate way. And keep in mind the 4-process framework, because it can help you give coherence and substance, let's say, quote unquote, to your teaching. If children learn to be curious about difference, language learning becomes a bridge and not a barrier, as we often say. So as final points, I would like to say that, and I would like all of us to remember that intercultural learning is not additive knowledge. It's not something that we just add or just throw in our teaching, but it is a developing competence. And the Council of Europe also stresses that. Intercultural education begins with the teacher's own stance towards difference. So as teachers, we also need to reflect, introspect, and think about our own biases and our own prejudices. Intercultural language teaching is not an extra component. It's a way of teaching language. Promoting cultural and intercultural awareness is not only about language, it's about shaping open-minded, empathetic, and globally aware individuals. And finally, the integration of cultural and intercultural awareness development into early education offers a transformative pathway. And I really stand by this. I think it's very important in helping our learners kind of transform and become more open-minded and more empathetic and respectful individuals. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for being here, for listening, and I'm open if we have time to talk about anything you would like to talk about.